you always have a sense of nervousness going into a new role, and particularly taking on a headship, in as much as you want to do right by an institution, and obviously it's been put in as a position as a result of the hard work of staff and students and the whole community. So you've got that sense of trepidation almost to kind of make sure there's no missteps, and then you add a global pandemic on top of that, and that heightens that sense. But
absolutely,
I mean, for me, I can only pay absolute tribute to the team that was in place in the school, at the warmth of the welcome that I had, to make sure that coming into role I was very quickly able to work with others to make sure that we kept students safe, that we abide by regulations, but also preserve the core of a strong educational offering. And that's what challenge does to schools, isn't it? It brings people together, and whatever the situation, whether it's transition or otherwise, you've got a good group of people who are just wanting the best for everyone there.
Welcome to the Independent School Podcast. Thinking and acting strategically is the key to both securing the future of your school and helping to build a more equal and just world. My name's Juliette Corbett. I'm a consultant, speaker and facilitator specialising in helping independent schools. In this podcast, I translate tried and tested strategy and fundraising techniques into a language that works for schools. So if you're a senior leader in a private school and you want your daily work to feel less exhausting and more strategic, and if you want once more to feel the joy of making the world a better place through education, then you're in the right place. Welcome, and let's get started on this week's episode. Hello and welcome to this week's episode, where I'm really excited to be joined by Paul Dwyer, who is head at Redmaids High School in Bristol. He's been in that position since September 2020. Redmaids High is a day school for girls aged 7 to 18, with a history dating back to 1634. Paul has a strong experience in girls' education, having previously been Deputy Head Curriculum at North London Collegiate School and Director of Sixth Form at Putney High School, both really prestigious girls' schools. In this conversation I'm sharing with you today, Paul and I talk about some of the key post-COVID trends that we're seeing in the independent school sector. So many of these started and have been developing before the pandemic, but then these are trends where things have either accelerated or shifted due to the changes that we experienced during the COVID pandemic. And we're really focusing in on three specific topics today. One of them is the relationships with staff, between schools and staff in a post-COVID era, and what that needs to look like. What does an excellent relationship look like with staff post-COVID? Deepening the dialogue between parents and teachers, and thinking about how that shifted due to technology, but also due to the changes in the pressures and that pupils are experiencing today as young people. And then finally, the growing importance of bursaries to improve accessibility into the independent school sector. Before we dive into the detail, I wanted to let you know about a free resource I've created to help you prepare your school for the coming economic impact of the invasion of Ukraine. It's a checklist of things you need to think about and take action on now, and it's designed to prompt strategic conversations around the issues that actually matter. You can download your free copy at www.consultjuliette.co.uk/checklist. Okay, now let's continue with this week's episode. So let's dive into my conversation with Paul Dwyer. So hello, Paul, and welcome to the Independent School Podcast. It's great to have you with us today.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
You're very welcome. So one of the questions I love to start with is I'd love to hear a little bit about the root of your passion for education. When we dedicate our career to one sector, obviously it's because we enjoy it, but there must be a reason that you kind of got into this education game in the first place. So are you able to track that back to a particular element of where that roots within your history, your experience?
That's a good question. I think for me, if I look back, there are always moments you can pick out of individual teachers who've made a great difference to me, as I suppose many teachers will often reflect on. But in a more general sense, I suppose what I always felt is that going through schooling, going through education was always that sense of opportunity that it offered to me, and the sense of teachers who wanted to spark a curiosity, teachers who wanted to see you interested in their areas of passion. And even if you don't go into it, it's okay, because they love chemistry anyway and just like to talk about it. So it's always that sense of excitement that I suppose my teachers were able to put across. And I suppose looking back, there is that sense of, I was very fortunate to have the kind of schooling that I did, to have the kind of teachers who were just interested in nurturing young people. I went to a comprehensive school in Accrington, and I was the first in my family to go to university as a result of the teachers I had, and that just sense of possibility that they opened up. So for me, wanting to get into education was to try and partly pay some of that back, and to kind of recognize what that can do for others. And I've always been a person who's excited about, possibility and new ideas and trying things out, and actually to be able to pass that feeling on, whether it's in my subjects in history or whether it is now as a senior leader in a school, that's exciting to me. So I think it's that general feeling of possibility that I've tried to hold on to and always cherished, really.
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes I find that's fed back to you by the sense of optimism and possibility that the young people bring to the conversation as well. It sort of continues to fuel you through the career to know that actually this is the one time that these young people are going through school. This is their one chance to have that formative opportunity to open those doors.
Absolutely. And I think that's something that, even in the last decade, I've noticed is in danger of changing, that the pressures that young people feel now to perform at their very best, that the idea of, well, I always find it interesting and never helpful on GCSE results day. There's always a number of celebrities who will put out there saying, oh, don't worry if you don't get what you're looking for. I got 3 U's and I'm now a millionaire or something like that. And I think for our young people, they do see it as so high stakes, that actually that difference between a 7 and an 8, an 8 and a 9 is really palpable to them. And do we recognize that enough in schools? How do you account for that? Mm-hmm. And to say nothing of then the changing dynamic on a global political stage around them, in a way that, when I was growing up, we certainly had challenges, but nothing as seismic as we've been through in the last 4 or 5 years either. So some really interesting things to note as a school leader, and to account for, but also to try and still project that sense of optimism. It's not blind. It's not saying, look, it's all going to be okay because we say it is, but actually students can be empowered to take action and to make sure that the difference is there because of what they've done, rather than feeling hopeless about it.
Absolutely. And resilience, it might be a topic that we touch on later, but I think that sense of resilience, that we can help young people to find their own methods of building their resilience. So that is then a lifelong skill that we can call on as we go through those challenges. Yeah. So you joined Redmaids High School in September 2020. Now, whenever I look at a head's kind of biog and I see that kind of date from beginning a headship, I think, gosh, that must have been a pretty good roller coaster to be starting with. How have you found the last few years? Because obviously it's been a real sense of change across the sector, hasn't it?
It has been. And I must confess, you always have a sense of nervousness going into a new role, and particularly taking on a headship, in as much as, you want to do right by an institution. And obviously it's been put in as a position as a result of the hard work of staff and students and the whole community. So you've got that sense of trepidation almost to kind of make sure there's no missteps, and then you add a global pandemic on top of that, and that heightens that sense. But
absolutely,
I mean, for me, I can only pay absolute tribute to the team that was in place, in the school, at the warmth of the welcome that I had, to make sure that coming into role, I was very quickly able to work with others to make sure that we kept students safe, that we abide by regulations, but also preserve the core of a strong educational offering. And that's what challenge does to schools, isn't it? It brings people together, and whatever the situation, whether it's transition or otherwise, you've got a good group of people who are just wanting the best for everyone there. So I think it was interesting because, in another vein, and people will comment in terms of saying, oh gosh, it must have been very difficult to take over in a pandemic. And of course, it's probably not what you'd wish for when you do take over. But at the same time, it did allow me to get to know the community quickly, because you really do recognize the core essence of a school, don't you? What really is important to people, and what you can make sure you don't mess with too heavily. And at the same time, I got to the end of the year and I was commenting to parents, that I felt that there was like a third of the school that I hadn't seen yet. I hadn't seen sports fixtures, I hadn't done a whole assembly. There was no kind of drama performances really. So to get those back underway this year, I suppose, has been a privilege, because I feel I've got the benefit of doing my first year all over again, but with a bit more institutional knowledge. So it's almost the best of both worlds.
Yeah. And going back to that comment about optimism, I think that is a way to look for the benefits of doing it that way. And I think as well, when a community goes through a really difficult time, it does shine a very strong spotlight on those things what the strengths of that community and what's leading that community successfully through something like this, as well as sometimes shining the spotlight on things that aren't entirely working well and that need shifting and changing. So I guess in that sense, everything was in slightly sharper relief to some extent.
No, that's very fair.
Yeah. One of the things that absolutely fascinates me is to think about the trends that are changing in our external environment, be them social, technological, economic, etc., environmental, and to think about the fact that in most cases, COVID hasn't changed those trends, but it has accelerated a number of them, either in a good way or a challenging way, depending on the interaction between those trends. I wonder if you've had thoughts around which areas you now look at slightly differently because you've been through COVID, which maybe were seeded as shifts that were happening in the sector, the whole school sector prior to COVID, but now you see things in a slightly different way or in a slightly different, seeing them as an opportunity to make slightly different changes.
Yeah, it's been a fascinating question that we've been really getting to grips with over recent months, and I anticipate we'll wrestle with the months ahead. Actually, I think in essence we are really considering what does it mean to be a teacher, not just in a school like Redmaids High, but in a sector like our own, or indeed in general. What does it mean to be a teacher? What do we give back and recognize the value of contributions? How is that shown, while also preserving preserving the institution and what we offer to our students, and it's such a fine balance. I've certainly used the phrase in previous schools that I've worked in that where I have been frustrated with senior leaders that I've worked under, or that I have recognized as a frustration in terms of something I haven't moved on quickly enough, is there's a danger sometimes schools can rely on the goodwill of too few. It is those people who will volunteer for Duke of Edinburgh expeditions, or will throw themselves into, fixtures or whatever it may well be. And does that mean that not all colleagues are playing the same role? Well, no. Is it that, we need to recognize the balance between incentivizing and expecting, I suppose, so does it mean to be a teacher to say, actually, it is a real involvement in all aspects of school life, the extracurricular involvement, being involved in trips, or is it that we want the best you can be in the classroom, and there's other ways that we have to look at the bits around the edges that are still valuable to students? Similarly, and this is a knottier one still, I wonder what the future of flexible working in schools will look like, and how we account for that better, because I think there is a degree to which certainly colleagues whose spouses or family members are seeing the changes that COVID has provoked, more working from home, more opportunities to be flexible in hours, and then that side of things. And I think that's a silver lining of COVID, is actually finally unlocking that conversation that was already in train. Obviously, the dictates of a school timetable don't make that easy, that we are in school from 8:30 till 4 or whatever it may well be. And so how do you build that in? So, I mean, there are people that are chipping away at that, so the work that Lindsay Patience has done, for example, is, I think, tremendous in that regard. And we as a school, we put 2 people in posts as professional development opportunities that over the course of this year have been doing some research into, flexible working. So what good practice in schools is, and what other organizations are doing around this. And they're going to feed back their recommendations to, what questions we should be asking ourselves, which shibboleths we should be challenging and saying, well, actually, does it matter how people use their PPA time if they're on site or not? And in between, what the other facets of flexibility actually looks like. So I think there's a really interesting dynamic at play there, and one that I want to do justice to. But of course, that justice is to the staff and the individuals as much as it is the students and the institution.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of this stems from much wider changes that we're seeing in society. Obviously, as you mentioned, flexible working, also with regards to the amount of time that people want in the evenings and weekends. There's a sense, especially in some of the more established boarding schools, perhaps not so much perhaps in a day school as yours, but that your entire life is dedicated to school, and that's the way it has to be. And I think a lot of schools, in actual fact, my experience back in Oxford and Cambridge colleges was very similar. A lot of these organisations are realising that actually that's no longer going to attract the best potential within the field. And although that may be tenable for some years to come, in actual fact, if you're looking to attract especially young, up-and-coming professionals within the sector who have really great potential that can be brought out through working with your school, it may be actually looking more deliberately at those expectations beyond the classroom. I think it's really important to understand that within a context of social shifts and change across the whole of society, actually.
Absolutely. I think that there's an interesting horizon that I can see ahead, in that as the workforce in schools does get younger, and I don't want to sound like, one of those back in my days kind of things, but, there is an element to which when you're an NQT, when you're an early careers teacher, you do kind of throw yourself into everything, isn't it? You're eager to please. You want to be the person that actually is getting to know the kids in every shape and form. So that might be, running certain activities or clubs and stuff. And of course, that is a generalization. And I know colleagues who've been teaching for 30 years who are still just as fond of doing those kind of things. But for those who come into the workforce now, I think there is that recognition of wanting to be valued in a different manner, or that are keener to recognize the importance in their mind of a work-life balance, and also I suppose that element of wanting to move quickly, of wanting to seek promotion or further opportunities. And I don't say that as a bad thing. I'm very fortunate to have been moving through things reasonably quickly myself. I'm the last person to argue against that. But are schools set up for it in terms of, where that movement comes from, what opportunities you can give without just saying, well, anyone who wants a promotion can just have one, And I think there is that dynamic, which I've started to suggest to my team, of saying, look, we need to be clear of what, as a school, our expectations are. And I do think there is that sense of potentially compromise on certain areas that we held on to a little bit harder in the past. And then at the same time, being pragmatic enough that if we're still having these conversations in 2 years' time, if I still am sometimes struggling to staff a certain trip or activity or something that doesn't quite, have the same backup options available to you, maybe we're getting it wrong. Maybe actually it is time to say, well, it was once like this, and schools are now having to recognize the change. And I don't want to preempt and get there too quickly, because actually there is a joy in schools, and there's lots of people who are still happy to be involved in that.
I think you're right to pick this up as a trend, though, because I think it's come up in a number of sort of strategy away days and conversations that I've had with heads and governors, noting that this shift is coming, and it's here now, and planning ahead for what that means. The other thing that resonates into my mind is thinking back to my MBA studies. This is called what the kind of the academics call a psychological contract. This is the fact that you expect a member of staff to do what's in their written contract and terms and conditions and so on. That's written down, but surrounding that is an unsaid, often sort of just it kind of emerges through time, layer of expectations about what member of staff is expected to do and what the school or the employer is expected to do, and where that psychological element of the contract, which is the non-written down section, isn't managed proactively, then expectations can be misaligned on both sides, and that tends to then lead, or can lead to, over time, kind of really disgruntled staff, people who are not happy in their role, people who see unfairness around them. And for example, one of those might be a member of staff might think the psychological contract includes everyone does their bit, all staff step up and do a little bit so that together we can achieve what we need to achieve. And if actually the reality is that a few staff step up, or some staff step up, but not all, and the other school doesn't enable that to feel fair or to be fair across all staff, then you start to have a breakdown in that psychological contract. I think it's a really interesting area of research that links to what we're talking about here, actually.
Yeah, and there's a danger, I think, of also potentially over legislating in this area, in that some of these areas are not easily comparable, are they? So if you're always in a grey area. If our contract says that we'd want everyone to be involved in the extracurricular life of the school. Now, do you say that, I don't know, I run a current affairs discussion group once a week. That's half an hour or 45 minutes at lunchtime. Does that equate to someone who does 3 Duke of Edinburgh expeditions a year? Well, probably not, but how do you then start to say to someone, I don't think you're necessarily doing as much extra, what is the definition of how much extracurricular? So these are finely balanced aspects, because as soon as you start to lose them because staff either are less keen or willing to run them, or don't feel that actually there's time because of the increased pressures on outcomes I mentioned earlier, then of course, particularly in the independent sector, that's part of the expectation of the offering, isn't it? So it's that, again, not trying to hold it over from that perspective that, we need to do this or else. We need to do this because we enjoy it. And it's part of, what the less pressured environment compared to, say, a maintained school who have, I suppose, different measures that they're subject to. And so it's trying to recognize that. And again, I don't ever want to be the kind of person who says, well, the grass is greener here, so you need to get on with it. It's such a finely balanced thing.
And of course, if this was easy, you'd have fixed it. So
well, yes,
it's
precisely.
Inevitably one of those sort of kind of tricky problems to solve. Yeah, absolutely. But I think you're right to pick it up as a trend. One of the others I wonder about, one of the other trends that we saw pre-COVID, which has been shifted and changed due to the situation in COVID, is the way that parent communications happen. So the communication between parents and schools. And I think, for many decades, there's been the sense that bringing up young people, there's a partnership between the parents and the role of schools, but that has shifted and changed due to the constraints during COVID and lockdown learning, et cetera, and then coming out the other end. I wonder if you have thoughts around what that now is starting to look like. Are there shifts and changes you're seeing there as well?
Yes, but I think they're still multifaceted in terms of, I don't know if it's one trend or many, actually, and we're still seeing if this is. And I suppose the other question that we keep going round about is this a COVID related blip, or is this part of that kind of longer term trend as you relate to there? Because for me, I would say where parents in general have been more forthcoming in the last 5 years or so is that they are starting to recognize, without being unfair to previous kind of generations at all, but starting to recognize the importance of either holistic education or the idea of, coming forward and saying if their sons or daughters are struggling mentally, or if there's issues at home. So I suppose that there is that sense where once what's happened in the home place was pretty much, kept in the home place unless it was a real emergency people need to be informed of. There is that, I suppose, opening up, and that's been welcomed from a school's perspective. I wonder if, and again, technology is helping to make this more readily accessible, and it can happen in a variety of ways, but just a sense of dialogue, actually, in terms of we do have it. Of course we do. A parents' evening is a dialogue between a parent, a student, and a teacher, but from an institutional perspective, we would tend to, in the past, either at Redmaids High or elsewhere, have information evenings. You will bring parents in, you will talk about online safety, you might have a guest speaker, and then you'll take questions at the end. And I've always been more fascinated in those conversations that happen afterwards, a parent who'll sidle up and say, oh, I'm really interested in this, or what do you think on that? And for me, that's something I think schools could create more space for. It's something we've been working on and are still tooling around but bringing parents in, saying, here's a topic of conversation. So we had one on careers in higher education, and basically saying, look, here's what we're noticing from a school's perspective. Here are the trends that we are trying to recognize. Here's the kind of advice and guidance we give to students. Is that what you were thinking we were doing? And what's your expectation? And what questions do you have? And actually talk to us about what you're talking about at home, what you're noticing, because I wonder sometimes if there is that kind of unassumed assumption that at homes, there is this conversation going on. In schools, there's this conversation going on. And I'm doing that wonderful thing on a podcast of gesticulating as if anyone can see what I'm saying. But
Go for it.
But both sides are having a conversation with the student. If they're not necessarily recognizing in the middle where there's any gaps, any misalignments, the students are either ended up confused or falling between the middle, because we're both assuming that the other side is having this conversation and actually knowing it. So some of those areas are low-lying fruits. I think use of technology, I think the nature of kind of workplace and higher education, as I say, some of them I think will need to be carefully thought through and planned. If you think about, say, relationship education, or the nature of pornography on the other side of online behaviors, I think there are areas that both sides are sometimes, recognizing those conversations have to be had and are nervous to do so. And actually, I don't want to barrel in there two-footed either, but I do think it's something that there's where the assumptions can be more damaging for students, because of course they're accessing things, at a younger age. Of course, they're exposed to more things that we just need to help them contextualize or recognize. And And that's where I think that the changes to RSE education, I think the changes and understanding and openness around PSHE is increasing and is improving. But maybe that dialogue element could still be built a bit more strongly.
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes there's a time lag potentially involved here as well. So as society shifts and changes, and the understanding of teachers as to what's happening with young people right now is potentially a little bit more up to date than, I mean, I'm a parent, let's be honest. I don't necessarily know what's completely up to date in terms of what they're talking about in the playground. So there's a sense of potentially wanting that to be a two-way dialogue, but at the same time allowing the actual reality that our young people are living through now to be really shared and understood amongst all those people, the young people, the teachers, and the parents as well.
Yeah, I think, growing up, we can all think back to our childhoods and probably recognize that the advice we were given, whether it was a teacher or a parent, was probably a year or two late, if not more. We all grow up a little bit faster than our elders will want us to and recognize. And again, I wonder if that gap is growing, in terms of the maturity and what students are contending with. And it's a real double-edged sword, because on one aspect, it is a maturity, and the issues that they're exposed to, the language, the dialogue, the imagery, all of that is far beyond what we'd have been doing at a corresponding age. But the same emotional maturity is not quite there yet. And I think that it breeds a feeling amongst, particularly that kind of 11 to 14-year-olds, whereby they assume they're more mature than they are. They want to hold on to issues. They're so conscientious and want to support their peers. They want to be, supportive of one another. And that makes it even more difficult for them to reach out and seek support from an adult, because actually they think we're disconnected, or they don't think we'd understand. And actually, is that an area that we recognize readily enough? I think we're getting better again, and I wouldn't want to be too pessimistic about it, but it is, as a parent of a 4-year-old, these are things that I recognize. Gosh, did I know anything like that at 4? I don't think I did, just in terms of the TV, the language, that, it's that side of things, and probably says more about my parenting than anything else. But, I think
it makes you feel slightly more. So I have a 5-year-old and 8-year-old. It makes you feel slightly more content that it's not just me that's getting it. And those in the teaching profession also question themselves, which is quite reassuring.
And of course, I want to preserve an idea of, her being a particular, an appropriate 4-year-old in my mind. And of course, when I'm a parent of an 11-year-old, I will think the same. And actually, are we actually recognizing what's in front of us? And again, I'm generalizing. Many parents do, and it's not an issue that, lots of people face. But there are those kind of, again, hidden assumptions that I think dialogue can always help to pick up between the spaces that are otherwise left unsaid.
Yeah, absolutely. Thinking about some of the other big trends we're seeing in the sector, again, linking it through to shifts in society, and especially at the moment with the kind of quite worrying reports coming out around the cost of living crisis, the impact on various different parts of society that are living with a kind of a disadvantaged background. I wonder whether you have any thoughts on the rise of the number of bursaries within the sector that are being offered, the rise of partnerships with state schools, and the importance that feels to me like it's been there for many years, and there are some schools that have been doing it for decades, but that is coming center stage a lot more now than it had been prior to COVID.
Absolutely. I think rightly so. I would say that, I often get asked, and often from my own parents, actually, in terms of, given my background, I was a Sutton Trust student. So I went to the Sutton Trust summer schools, which kind of helped me to understand what applying to a university like Oxford could entail. I'm not from I suppose at all a typical independent school background. So I'm not challenged on why I now work in an independent school, but certainly asked, what perspectives do I see as different? And it's a little bit facile or even glib to say so, but I guess for me, it's always going back to the idea of possibility, the fact that, our students still need educating, and there is still, meaningful issues and challenges that all students will face, regardless of choices that are made on their behalf in terms of the educational institution they attend. But I would say that sometimes the independent sector in the past, both seeing it on the outside and on the inside, is that we have been too defensive on that principle, that, we have got some great models and exemplars of what meaningful bursary places can look like and the difference that those can make. I mean, the one that is held up most often, and again, rightly so, is, the King's Scholars at Eton. Those kind of things are really kind of life-changing. I wonder in the sector, what it means going forward. how we find that balance of supporting students from a variety of backgrounds and what that means to do so meaningfully. I think even if some have been spurred into action because of the increased pressure on our sector and the highlighting of these issues from a news perspective, to me, it doesn't matter. I think as long as everyone's at the ball game, then that's okay. And I think there's an increasing variety of creative solutions that people are looking for, so as a school, we've moved actually in terms of we means test all of our scholarships now. So anyone who is eligible for an academic, music or sports scholarship, any fee remission is actually on a means tested basis. And that has allowed us to be able to offer more in terms of financially assisted places and means for a widening participation basis. There's more opportunities that we can provide. One area I'm interested in and starting to needle at other schools in terms of if there is an appetite to do so is, we as a school will always know what the capacity is in a particular year group. So, if you need or that you're aiming for 96 to be full in a particular year group or 110, whatever it may well be in your school, if you don't fill that year group, is there not a marginal cost bursary you could offer to say, well, actually, I'm going to teach that class anyway. Does it matter if there's 22 or 23 in there? And again, make a difference to someone. Now, from a stat accounts point of view, obviously it looks like you're giving far more money in bursaries, but on a reality in the ground situation, you're not paying out anymore. I'm not increasing my staffing costs. And so it isn't that sense of cross-subsidizing from fees that, I think would make people nervous. So I wonder if there's, again, things in that area that we can be doing without being patronizing and just saying, look, we have space. There are students who would benefit from this space. So why not put two and two together,
Yeah, absolutely. And as with all these things, it's never quite as simple. One of the really interesting elements of that, I think there's a very strong argument for doing that. One of the difficulties comes when you're then talking to potential donors about the cost, in inverted commas, of a bursary and therefore how much is needing to be donated to enable a bursary to be created. It's really interesting when you have small number of bursaries, the argument really holds around marginal costing. But as soon as you start to grow your number of bursaries, if you have a kind of a stated desire to reach a certain threshold, which is significantly higher than where you are now, when you really work through the figures and the way it plays with potential donors, especially the way it plays with parents, if you're fundraising from those parents, it becomes much more complicated because the rationale starts to break down because it is no longer marginal cost because you've got more bursary holders in the classroom, which of course is exactly what we want. But it's really interesting to manage that process, to manage the communications, to really think through what you're telling potential donors, what you're telling parents. But yes, I think you're absolutely right. I know that there are schools that are doing that, exactly that. It's just, I think my advice is always, that's great, let's go for it, but let's think through really carefully how you're communicating this and how that's going to play out over the years ahead as well, so that you're doing it really strategically.
It needs to be thought through. I mean, I would say that if I have one frustration with the independent sector without being, biting the hand that feeds at all, I think it's fascinating that our schools, even in Bristol, we're all here for the same reason, which is to raise the standards of education for all. And in the independent sector, I always find it interesting and fascinating the way in which there's that tension between collaboration and competition, isn't there? And, you look at all of the ways that, whether it is in individual groups, I mean, we're part of the Bristol Educational Partnership, which I think is a brilliant mechanism for doing exactly these kind of things, or indeed, whether it's HMC, GSA, Society of Heads, but, think of the differences we could make of saying, well, why isn't there a coordinated bursary scheme? Why isn't there a sense of saying, look, actually, there's some students in Bristol that would be more favourable or would prefer to come to Redmaids High than to Clifton High, and vice versa. And so why don't we coordinate and do something on that basis to enable more? Because different schools will have access to different pools of donors. Some schools, and Redmaids High would be included in this, our alumni fundraising is small scale. It's trying to make small differences, just recognizing the community that we draw upon compared to, schools I've worked in where you're looking at donors who are donating, 6-7 figure sums. And so it's trying to say, look, is there a wider difference we can make there? If we recognize that diversity in teaching is a problem, which it absolutely is, £1,000 from each HMC school, how many scholarships for teacher training would that create? It doesn't seem to be to rocket science. I just think sometimes that we could be faster moving on some of these problems rather than just sitting back and appreciating the size and scale of it,
Yeah, Yeah, absolutely. And I think, as always, it's small scale pilots to see how things work, and a lot of these relationships are built on trust.
Absolutely.
And that collaborative partnership, and we see exactly the same between independent schools and state schools that are working together. It's built on the personal relationships and the trust that's built to ensure that both parts of that collaboration are feeling really comfortable with the way things are happening now and the way things are heading in future. Everyone's benefiting, mutual benefit for all.
Yeah, because you can absolutely get that wrong. There's a sense of, you don't want to go into the partner schools nearby and say, well, we've got this covered because we're the independent school. We're going to show you how it's done. And actually, I think there's a rewarding experience for staff in both schools if you can get that partnership right in terms of whether it's CPD, opportunities for students. And I think that can be very rich and rewarding. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Paul, for your time today. It's been really interesting to hear about some of those big picture trends that are happening, and some of them before COVID, some of them accelerated during COVID, but then to think about the fact that it's okay to say we don't have all the answers to this. And I think that there's some more collaborative conversation and some working together across the sector. I think you've identified some really important topics here around the offer that we make to staff and the way that we build those relationships with staff in the post-COVID era, the dialogues between teachers and parents, and also including pupils, and the role of partnerships and bursaries as well. So thank you so much for your time today with us, Paul. It's my pleasure. Thank you. And thank you for letting me ramble at you.
Thanks for listening to the Independent School Podcast, the podcast that helps senior leaders in private schools to think and act more strategically, both because they want to secure the future of their school and because they want to help build a more equal and just world. You can listen in everywhere that podcasts are available. And if you want to catch up on previous episodes or follow any of the links that I've mentioned today, just head over to www.consultjuliet.co.uk/podcast.